Shortly after my son was born, my then husband and I bought a 100-year-old house for our expanding family, which included the three of us and our medium-large dog. As someone who grew up afraid of the dark, after a strange incident with a neighbor boy looking in my windows as a child, I repeatedly had to tell myself that the creaks and thumps and sounds were normal for a house of that age, with old-growth trees that bumped the roof and scraped the windows at night, and noisy, radiant heat, and a back gate that wouldn't stay shut and clanked in the wind. I'd hear something, and instead of investigating, I'd hide under the covers, like any reasonable adult. When my then husband and I split up, I kept the creaky house, and he kept the medium-large dog. When my son was still small, the two of us were watching a movie in the front room around dusk when my phone died. As a Type B personality, the one charger I had was typically strewn somewhere about the house. This time, I found it in the kitchen. But as I crossed to the counter to plug it in, I had the overwhelming, goosebumpy, tingly, sinking sense that something was very, very wrong. I turned, and I realized that not only was the back gate open again, someone was sitting cross-legged in the yard, seemingly staring at the house. They had a hood and dark sunglasses, despite the fleeting light, and didn't move even when I stepped closer to the window to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. They remained eerily motionless when I was certain they could see me, and still even when I was pretty sure they could see that I had seen them. I quickly locked the back door, grabbed my phone and my charger, and headed into the dining room to my laptop, where I sent the first person I could see online a message that someone was sitting in my yard, staring at my house, and that my phone was dead, and to please call the police if they didn't hear from me in a few minutes. I assumed whoever was in the yard would leave once sighted, but nevertheless waited on tenterhooks, impatiently staring at my still useless phone. After an awkward conversation with my son about why we weren't going to the kitchen to get a glass of water, it finally lit up, and I was able to call 911. I tried to calmly explain to the dispatcher that I was sure the person was gone, but begged that they please send an officer to check my yard, as the motionless staring was unsettling at best. Keeping me on the phone, she asked if I could look out a window without being seen to verify, as well as check the locked door. I awkwardly crept as stealthily as I could toward the kitchen, slowly realizing that while the back door was locked, it also had a very clearly too large dog door, with no functioning way to block it. Panicking, I stood slightly in an attempt to scan the yard and came face to face with a hood and sunglasses staring down at me through the window. At this point, I was incoherent as the dispatcher urged me to grab my son and hightail it to a locked room. I dart back to him and explain, "We need to go now." And as I pick him up, I hear the clear and unmistakable sound of the dog door slowly swinging open. I abandoned the house, leaving the front door wide open, and dashed across the street to pound on my neighbor's door. Once inside, they kindly paused their dinner party to distract my son, while I stared across the street and messily sobbed about our very indoor cat we left behind. Not long after the officers arrived, they came through the side gate with hood and sunglasses in tow. They'd apprehended her calmly sitting on my back step, her arm lazily, purposefully swinging in and out of the dog door. I boarded the dog door shut that night, but we moved shortly thereafter, as I was never quite sure after that if all the nighttime knocks and bumps and open gates I'd been hearing were actually just the old house. Lena had always been close with her grandmother, who lived in a small house on the outskirts of town. Every weekend, Lena would visit her for tea and chat. But one Sunday, When Lena arrived, the door was ajar. That was unusual. Her grandmother was always meticulous about locking up. Lena stepped inside, calling out for her grandmother. There was no answer. The house was eerily quiet. She moved from room to room, but there was no sign of her grandmother. Finally, she went to the kitchen and found a note on the counter. "I'm okay. Don't worry." Confused and a little unsettled, Lena decided to call her grandmother. As soon as she dialed the number, the phone rang 3 times before it was picked up. "Hello?" came the voice on the other end. "Lena?" It was her grandmother, but something was off. Her voice sounded faint, distant, like she was speaking through a tunnel. "Grandma, where are you?" "I'm at the house, but you're not here," Lena said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm not far, honey. I'll be home soon," the voice replied, but there was an odd pause. Then it said, "Are you sure you're alone?" Lena froze. "Yes, Grandma, I'm fine." There was another pause before the voice on the other end suddenly changed. The tone turned dark, distorted. "Don't turn around, Lena," it whispered, the words sending a chill down her spine. Confused and terrified, Lena slowly turned, looking toward the kitchen doorway. Standing there, silhouetted in the dim light, was her grandmother, her expression vacant. Lena dropped the phone in shock, but it continued to ring from the kitchen counter. When Lena tried to speak to her grandmother, the figure just stared at her, unmoving. She slowly backed away, but the figure didn't follow. Instead, the voice on the phone continued, "Lena, I told you, I'm not far." Clara had always been a light sleeper, so when she moved into her new apartment, she was relieved to find that it was quiet. The building was old, the kind of place where the walls creaked and groaned, but it was peaceful. She enjoyed the solitude, her only company being her dog, Daisy. But it didn't take long for Clara to notice something strange about the apartment next door. At first, it was just little things. Footsteps in the hall when no one was supposed to be there, flickering lights, a shadow moving under the door when the apartment seemed empty. One night, Clara decided to investigate. She knocked on the door of the apartment next door, but there was no answer. The door was slightly ajar, so she pushed it open, calling out softly. No one responded. Inside, everything was perfectly in place. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the air felt thick, heavy. It was then that Clara noticed something odd on the wall. A calendar, with dates crossed out in red. The last date was just a few days ago. That night, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Daisy, usually calm, growled at the door to the apartment next door, her fur bristling. Clara tried to brush it off, but the noise from next door grew louder, scratching at the walls, like something was trying to escape. The next morning, she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, there stood the neighbor, a gaunt, pale man. His eyes were hollow, and he didn't speak, just stared at her with a chilling gaze. I didn't mean to intrude," Clara stammered. The man gave a slight nod, then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall. That afternoon, Clara received a call from the landlord. "Clara, I'm afraid the tenant in apartment 3B has passed away. He died 2 days ago, in his sleep." Clara's heart skipped a beat. The man she had just seen, was he still alive? She hadn't seen him leave the apartment that morning. And that night, as she lay in bed, Daisy started barking furiously at the door. Clara's heart raced. When she opened it, there was no one there. but she could hear faint scratching sounds coming from the walls. Something was trying to get out. Evan was a skeptic. He didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural events. He only believed in facts. So when he read about the old abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town, he decided to explore it. The asylum had been closed for over 30 years, its doors locked after a string of mysterious deaths and disappearances. The building had become a local legend, and for Evan, that was the perfect place to prove there was no truth to the rumors. He arrived at dusk, the sky painted in deep purples and blues. The asylum loomed in the distance, its crumbling stone facade covered in ivy and dirt. The gates were rusted shut, but with a little effort, Evan was able to slip through a gap in the fence. The air inside felt wrong, thick with the scent of decay and mildew. Evan made his way through the front entrance, which creaked open as if welcoming him inside. The halls were dark, the floors covered in layers of dust. Faded paintings and broken furniture lined the walls. It felt as if time had forgotten this place. He pulled out his flashlight and began to explore, snapping photos of the decrepit interior. It wasn't long before he stumbled upon a set of old patient records scattered across the floor. Most of them were too faded to read, but one name stood out: Margaret Thorne. Her file described her as a patient who had been locked away in solitary confinement for years, deemed violent and unpredictable. Her last entry, written by a doctor, was unsettling. Margaret spoke of voices in the walls, voices that no one else could hear. She said they were watching her. Evan's curiosity deepened. He decided to find her room. The deeper he ventured into the asylum, the colder it became. He passed locked doors and hallways that seemed to twist back on themselves. The sound of his footsteps echoed off the walls, and he began to feel the first stirrings of unease. But he shook it off, reminding himself that it was just an old building, full of dust and history. Finally, he reached a room at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the room was empty, save for a single bed and a small window covered in grime. It was as if the room hadn't been touched in decades. But as he stepped inside, he felt something shift in the air. A coldness settled around him. He turned to leave, but then he heard it, scratching, soft, barely audible coming from the walls. He froze. The scratching grew louder, frantic, as if something or someone was trying to claw its way out. Then, a voice, soft but clear, whispered from the corner of the room, "Leave, before it's too late." Evan's heart pounded. He turned to look, but there was nothing there. His flashlight flickered and then went out. The air grew thick, and the temperature plummeted. Panicking, Evan ran for the door, but it slammed shut in his face. He backed away, his pulse racing. The scratching intensified, now accompanied by whispering voices, some pleading, others demanding, "Get out!" With all his strength, Evan threw his body against the door, and it flew open. As he stumbled into the hallway, he heard something behind him, a low, guttural growl. He ran through the asylum, the voices following him, growing louder, echoing through the empty halls. When he reached the entrance, he saw the door to the asylum swing open on its own, as if the building was releasing him. But just as he stepped outside, he turned to look one last time. The door slammed shut behind him, and he caught a glimpse of something standing in the window. A woman's face, twisted in agony. Evan never spoke of what happened that night, but every time he closed his eyes, he could still hear the whispers calling him back to the asylum. Megan and her friends, Nate Alice and Josh decided to hike through the dense forest that bordered their town. It was a local attraction, known for its beauty, but also for the strange legends surrounding it. Most locals avoided it after dark, speaking of eerie sounds and an unsettling presence within. But the group, confident and excited, had no fear as they set out on a bright Saturday morning. The hike was supposed to be a one-day trip, a fun escape from the monotony of their lives. As they walked deeper into the forest, the light began to dim. The trees grew thicker, their canopies blocking out the sunlight, leaving them in a dark, cool world of shadow. The air grew thick, heavy with silence. After hours of walking, they came across a clearing that none of them recognized. The trees here were twisted, their bark knotted and gnarled as though something had warped them. In the center of the clearing was a large, flat rock, smoothed by time and weather. "Let's take a break," Alice suggested, wiping her brow. They all agreed and sat on the stone. For a while, they chatted and joked, but Megan felt a strange unease. It wasn't just the eerie quiet, but something else. A feeling that the forest was watching them, waiting. The unease grew when they heard the first echo. It was faint at first, barely audible, like a whisper carried on the wind. Megan looked around, trying to pinpoint the source. "What was that?" she asked, a slight tremor in her voice. Nate and Josh shrugged it off, dismissing it as an animal. But Alice wasn't so sure. She strained her ears, and the whisper came again, louder this time. It sounded almost like her name. The air turned colder, the shadows deeper. The echoing whispers came more frequently, some repeating their names, others muttering words they couldn't understand. Suddenly, they heard a loud rustling from behind them, in the woods beyond the clearing. Everyone tensed, turning around to face the noise, but there was nothing there, just the thick, oppressive trees. The whispers began to grow louder, almost frantic now. Megan's heart raced, her palms sweating. "We need to leave," she said, standing up quickly. But as she turned, something caught her eye. Near the edge of the clearing, in the shadows of the trees, there was a figure. It was tall, almost impossibly tall, with long, twisted limbs. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but its eyes gleamed red, like burning coals. Panic surged through Megan as she screamed for her friends to run. But as they moved, the figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. Every step it took echoed in a way that shouldn't have been possible, like it was mimicking their own. "Run," Megan cried again, but the others were frozen, staring at the figure, mesmerized. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the whispers turned into cries, screams of torment, of people lost to the forest. Then, the figure lunged, its limbs stretching impossibly long, grabbing Josh first, its fingers digging into his skin like claws. He screamed, but his voice was drowned by the chorus of otherworldly cries. Megan, Alice, and Nate ran, pushing through the trees, but no matter how fast they ran, they could hear the figure's whispers chasing them, getting closer, wrapping around them like a cold, suffocating fog. When they finally stumbled back to the edge of the forest, the sun had set, and the whispers had stopped. But when they turned to look back at the woods, there was no sign of Josh, no sign of the figure, just the echo of their own breaths, haunting them with the memory of the woods.